How is blasphemy punished in Islam? Islam is the most misinterpreted religion in the world, particularly because of historical inaccuracies that had been spreading for a long time. Arabs in pre-Islamic Arabia would often spread false information about Muhammad and his followers, and some of those stories inadvertently ended up becoming parts of religious booklets, and those false accounts were even adopted by some Muslim scholars who thought those to be authentic prophetic narrations. Hence, in order to understand the Islamic religion, it is necessary to study only the Quran, as Muslims believe that this book has never been altered in any way. Unfortunately, since many of the followers of Islam also believe in the false propaganda, I prepared this presentation after considerable discussions with archaeologists and historians as well as Muslim scholars who pointed out to me the numerous inconsistencies in many theological books. I aim to discuss an aspect of Islam that has been grossly misunderstood, and that is how a Muslim is called on to treat those fellow humans who wronged or insulted them. Recent media attention on the cartoon drawings of religious and spiritual figures raised many questions about this subject. How did Muslim Prophet Muhammad treat those who were cruel and harsh to him? Did he forgive his enemies? Few people concern themselves with approaching the religious texts with an open mind or studying the holy books objectively, but content themselves with their own, often biased, interpretation of the faith. In this brief presentation, we will attempt to go over a few of the most controversial and least understood topics in Islam. Islam is a comprehensive religion guiding the lives of its followers through sets of rules governing the personal, social, and public aspects through the verses of the Quran and the compilation of the traditions of the Muslim Prophet Muhammad. During 6th century Arabia, Islam laid down rules for humane treatment of enemy prisoners, and put forth strict guidelines for warfare, which was permitted only under extenuating circumstances. Muslim scholars insist that the humane and noble attitude which Islam exhorts its followers to adopt on the battlefield cannot be found in the history of any other nation. Some Christian historians admit that prior to the advent of Islam, the world had never seen a code of military ethics more noble and compassionate than the moral tone adopted by Islam's Prophet Muhammad and his successors, Abu Bakr and Umar. The sentiments of justice and principles of toleration which Islam advocated were astonishing to Roman emperors and Orthodox bishops, who had never adopted such moral codes as the rule of conduct. However, in recent times, due to the regurgitating influence of the fast-paced, and often biased media, some Western critics have claimed that reckless violence exists in Islam. But in the past 14 centuries, Muhammad and his Muslim followers had rarely engaged in warfare, and even then, maintained the highest code of military conduct. During the Crusades, when Muslims were being massacred by numerous Christian leaders, the followers of Islam continued to live by the principles taught by Muhammad. In 1181, when the Third Crusade was underway, the King of England, also known as Richard the Lionheart, took several thousand Muslims prisoners and promised to exchange them for his own men who were captured. But he later backed on his word and brought 3,000 Muslim men, women and children before him, all of whom were bound with ropes. King Richard ordered their execution, and his soldiers swiftly flung themselves upon the helpless prisoners all at once and massacred them with sword and lance in cold blood. Although the Muslim leader Saladin witnessed this genocide, he reminded his men about the noble conduct of warfare Islam exhorted them to abide by, and hence, even at that critical juncture, utmost regard was always shown to human life, honor and property even on the battlefield. There is no doubt that many battles took place between pagan Arabs and Muslims during the lifetime of Muhammad, but in the 80 skirmishes that took place, less than 1,000 people lost their lives on both sides, and none of the deceased included civilians or women or children. Out of the 1,000 who were killed, nearly 300 were Muslims, whilst the remaining belonged to the opposing party. It should also be noted that Muslims were forced to defend their homes against overwhelming odds and never actively sought out violence nor invaded any nation unprovoked. To revert to the original question, let us look into what Islam says about those who mistreat or insult this faith or its prophet. Islam is a religion that shows compassion to all humans and animals as mentioned in the Quran and sayings of Muhammad. Islam instructs people to forgive others and seek forgiveness from God. Even when a person is being wronged by others, Islam asks him not to despair of the mercy of God. Rather, Islam's Prophet Muhammad is reported to have forgiven all his enemies, including those who insulted or tortured him. In chapter 3 of the Quran, God or Allah informs Muslims that the righteous are those who subdue anger and forgive people. And Allah loves those who do good. Verse 134. While Muhammad displayed great tolerance in his lifetime, the same cannot be said about all the other leaders of various neighboring empires. For instance, Louis IX, who lived from 1214 to 1270, and was crowned following the death of his father Louis VIII, was commonly known as Saint Louis or Louis the Saint. He was a popular leader and was the only king of France to be canonized in the Catholic Church. As an adult, Louis IX became one of the most notable European monarchs of the Middle Ages. His reign is remembered as a medieval golden age in which the Kingdom of France reached an economic as well as political peak. His fellow European rulers esteemed him highly for his reputation of fairness and moral integrity. He was a reformer and developed French royal justice system. However, Louis IX was an ambitious leader and led the 7th and 8th Crusades against the Muslims and slaughtered thousands of people. France's Louis IX revered his Catholic orthodoxy values, and upon assuming power, he unleashed a reign of terror among his subjects, by passing barbaric laws. One of Louis's favorite punishment was to punish blasphemy by mutilation of the face. Anyone speaking ill of Christianity or Jesus would have their lips and tongue cut off. In addition to not tolerating blasphemy, Louis IX ordered the burning of over 12,000 manuscript copies of the Talmud and other Jewish books. For centuries, Louis IX was considered to be the ideal Christian ruler because he was inspired by Christian zeal and Catholic devotion, but some historians express their horror when mentioning the draconic blasphemy laws King Louis had set in place during his time. But punishing blasphemy in this brutal way was not unique to France. Many other nations in Europe adopted this practice and would torture or burn non-Christians to death. Centuries later, many years after the Crusades, England continued to practice similar laws and punished blasphemy most severely. The offence of blasphemy was originally part of canon law. During late 1100s, Pope Innocent III instituted a special church office to investigate and prosecute heresy, a systemic persecution we now know as the Inquisition. The Inquisition used torture to punish heresy, and those who refused to renounce their beliefs were put to death, typically by burning at the stake, since burning was considered a wonderful punishment that purified the sinner. Since the only Christianity accepted in Western Europe at that time was Roman Catholicism, anyone entertaining doctrines contrary to the teachings of the Church were considered heretics. It was in 1415 that the Czech theologian, Catholic priest and religious reformer, John Huss, was dragged to a public execution place in Germany and bound to the stake with a chain around his neck. The mob piled wood up to his chin, and set him on fire for asserting that Jesus Christ, not the Pope, was the head of the Church. However, 14 centuries earlier, Islam's founder Muhammad announced to the world that all men and women were equal before God, and every human being was free to worship as they pleased. Speaking ill of God, or the Prophet was not punishable under Muslim practices, because Islam invites others to question this faith, and its tenets. Maiming, torturing or burning people who reject the Islamic faith is strictly forbidden by the Islamic God, and the Quran 5th chapter announces, "Do not let the hatred of people prevent you from being just. Be just." And elsewhere in the Quran it is mentioned that God loves those who act justly. The Islamic prophet taught people that the hallmark of a Muslim is that he, if wronged by others, does not flare up in anger and does not lose his self-control. Rather he forgives the wrongdoers from the depths of his heart. These Islamic laws were however not followed in Europe, and thousands of people were constantly suffering from religious persecution under both Catholic and Protestant leaders. In 1378, Pope Gregory XI commanded the persecution of John Wycliffe and the Lollards for voicing their dissent. This allowed the torture and murder of many innocent Protestant leaders. A decade later, King Henry IV passed laws in 1400 that enabled the torture and imprisonment of heretics. It allowed the bishops to arrest all preachers of heresy, all schoolmasters infected with heresy, and all owners and writers of heretical books. On refusal to solemnly renounce their faith, the heretic would be paraded before the public and there be burnt in a huge fire. Hundreds of people were hanged, and burnt in England between 1414 and 1506, due to blasphemy, and this list included a number of prominent women, notably the Protestant preacher Anne Askew, who was brutally tortured in the Tower of London, and in June of 1546, Anne was burnt at the stake as a heretic by the order of King Henry VIII. Many fellow Protestants in England were outraged by the treatment meted out to Anne, particularly because she was tortured in the rack, and stretched violently, until her bones and limbs were completely broken. Anne Askew was terribly handicapped, but this did not prevent the English courts to order her execution, and despite the excruciating pain she was suffering from, she was carried to the stake by the guards, and burned alive, in front of a jeering English mob. When the former Archbishop of Canterbury briefly abandoned his Catholic faith, he was sentenced to death for blasphemy. But he later recanted his Protestant faith on March of 1556, in order to be spared being burnt at the stake. Despite these recantations, Queen Mary I refused to pardon him and he was burned alive for heresy. After the death of King Henry, his daughter, Queen Mary of England continued to persecute people under English blasphemy laws. 1556, Peretin Massey and her sister, Guillemine Gilbert, and their mother, Catherine Corches, were charged with receiving a stolen goblet, but the women were found not guilty. However, during the trial it was recorded that the women had not been attending church and therefore all three women were found guilty of heresy and condemned to be burnt at the stake. Peretin was pregnant, but Catholics in the 16th century thought it was acceptable to kill the unborn and therefore execute pregnant women. The women were burnt on the same fire, but the belly of the pregnant woman burst by the impact of the flame and her child fell into the ground. But when onlookers expressed desire to rescue the child, the executioner ordered the infant to be carried back again, and cast into the fire. Queen Mary's successor, Elizabeth I, was the daughter of Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth was of a Protestant mindset, and instituted fines and penalties for non-attendance at Church of England services. Her regime also began to enforce strict penalties against those found guilty of sheltering priests and Jesuits. Catholics faced untold persecution during the second half of Elizabeth I's reign. One of the well-known victims was Margaret Clitheroe, who was pressed to death during the Elizabethan regime. Margaret Clitheroe, a wealthy Englishwoman, who had converted to Roman Catholicism in 1574, risked her life by harboring priests in her home, which was made a capital offense by the Jesuits, etc. Act 1584. The act commanded all Roman Catholic priests to leave the country or be executed. Those who sheltered them also faced possible execution for treason. After she was arrested for harboring priests, a criminal offense punishable by death in an Act of Parliament of 1581, Margaret was jailed and was repeatedly asked to plead guilty. In an attempt to persuade her to conform to trial by jury, the judges ordered the horrific barbarity of crushing Margaret to death. The officials who were tasked with carrying out the sentence took Margaret to her house, where she was stripped and then placed upon a rock. The door of her house was taken apart and placed on top of the pregnant woman, and as she lay in agony, the executioners slowly loaded the panel with 800 pounds of rocks and stones. Witnesses reported that she died in terrible agony, slowly being crushed to death. Although this mode of execution seems shocking to readers of this century, it was a common punishment for blasphemy under the English laws. Catholics were routinely crushed to death by court order, and while Margaret died within hours of being crushed, other victims of blasphemy under Henry VIII's laws were not so fortunate. When Henry VIII was King of England, he wanted to dissolve the power of the Catholic Church and acquire all its wealth and property. He had thousands of monks executed and destroyed their monasteries. The monasteries were home to more than 10,000 monks, nuns and friars. It was during his reign that women were burned to death for reading or preaching the Bible. Anne Askew was a noble woman who happened to be a preacher. The king accused her of religious heresy because he had passed the Act for the Advancement of the True Religion that banned women from reading the Bible private or openly, but Anne was persistent in studying her scriptures. She was arrested for her crimes, and kept in the Tower of London, and tortured so severely that all her limbs broke, and the executioners had to carry her in a stretcher to burn her alive at the stake. At that time, in England, it was a grave crime for women to read Bible. So when the king's sixth wife, Catherine Parr, engaged in theological discussions with other women and read the Bible, Henry VIII also signed an order for her arrest on a charge of heresy and agreed to send her to the Tower. But fortunately, his wife was able to remove all the Bibles from the palace and convinced the king that he was mistaken. Executing men and women for heresy and blasphemy was as common as was executing women on unsubstantiated charges of adultery. After Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn, he got bored with the new wife and accused Anne of adultery, incest, and treason in order to have her executed. After beheading Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII married one of Anne's lady-in-waiting only 10 days after the execution. Henry VIII's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was also beheaded. She was a young girl of 16. But the court went forth with the execution order and had her beheaded. Many years after Queen Mary's demise, the English courts continued to punish citizens for blasphemy. And in 1656, the English Quaker leader James Naylor, who preached against the slave trade, was accused of blasphemy, and was subsequently sentenced by the Second Protectorate Parliament to flogging, to be pilloried, branded on the forehead, and the piercing of his tongue by a red-hot poker, and thereafter kept in prison on hard labor indefinitely. From the 16th century to the mid-19th century, blasphemy against Christianity was held as an offense against common law. And these blasphemy laws were used as a legal instrument to persecute atheists and people of other faiths. All sorts of blasphemy, including all profane scoffing at the biblical scriptures, and exposing any part thereof to contempt or ridicule, were punishable by the temporal courts with death, imprisonment, corporal punishment and fine. While medieval Christians practiced the blasphemy laws zealously, the laws continued to flourish into the 20th century, and in as recent as 1921, Britain's courts sent John William Gott to prison for blasphemy for publishing pamphlets. In these pamphlets Gott satirized the biblical story of Jesus entering Jerusalem and comparing Jesus to a circus clown. He was sentenced to 9 months of hard labor despite suffering from an incurable illness, and died shortly after he was released. Why are Muslims concerned about prophets' cartoons? Recent media events hosted by magazines in France and Denmark displayed cartoons of the Muslim prophet Muhammad, purportedly as an expression of the freedom of speech. While some people denounced the caricatures as representing a distasteful sense of humor, many Muslims were least bothered by the caricatures itself. Critics agree that it is unfortunate that some French satirical magazine feel it must insult the dead in order to create humorous content, but drawing cartoons of the Arab prophet is not a dramatic issue to most viewers. Muslims admit that their faith teaches them to respect the deceased, whoever they are, so generally, as Muslims, if someone dishonored their dead parents and drew graphic cartoons of them, they would be very sad, indeed, but so would any average human being, including perhaps the ordinary Frenchman. Some Muslim scholars were quick to point out that the cartoon of Muhammad served as a reminder of how their prophet treated his enemies. In 7th century Arabia, there were thousands of pagans who refused to believe in the Arab prophet Muhammad and rejected his calls to believe in one God and to give alms to the poor. The wealthy entrepreneurs would often hire poets to defile and disgrace the prophet, and they would instruct street urchins to pelt the prophet with stones, so much that blood would pour from his body and fill his shoes, but Muhammad never took revenge on them, because he lived as an emblem of sheer mercy. It was his way of living to forgive and make peace with his enemies. Many Muslims imagine that in 21st century, had Muhammad witnessed the trend of publishing and reprinting silly drawings and cartoons, or caricatures of him in many European magazines, he would hardly have become agitated over it, and would have likely instructed his followers to reciprocate with love. What would the Islamic reaction be? Muhammad was known to have extended the olive branch to those who brutally killed and then mutilated the body of his uncle Hamza. Muhammad's uncle Hamza was one of the most beloved of all people to the Muslim prophet, but Muhammad did not avenge his death. Instead, he decided to show mercy on his killers, and forgave the woman who ordered the despicable form of assassination. By preaching the basic tenets of Islam, Muhammad taught Arabs that they should be patient and steadfast in the face of adversity. In the Muslim holy book known as the Quran, God advises the adherents of Islam to adopt compassion towards all. Let them pardon and forgive. Do you not love that Allah should forgive you? And Allah is oft forgiving, most merciful. Verse 22 of chapter 24. If people are wronged, then they should endeavor to show compassion and understanding towards the wrongdoer rather than seek vengeance. Throughout his life, Muhammad emulated such words with his own example, and rather than simply turning the other cheek, Islam encouraged its adherents to go beyond passive reciprocation, and engage in active goodness to the wrongdoer. Muhammad encouraged Muslims to adopt a moralistic and didactic behavior and called on them to create loving connections and relationships with those who wrong them, and those with whom Muslims might disagree. If Muhammad's practice was applied to recent events, such as the caricatures of some biblical prophets, including Muhammad's, it should be apparent on what the Islam's prophet would have demanded. Some nations with Muslim majority populations have called for boycott of French products, but many Muslim jurists consider this reaction to be too extreme, and claim it has no basis in Islam. Those people who called for the boycotts did not understand the mindset of the Islamic prophet. He served as a moral and ethical exemplar for all of humankind. During the early days of his prophethood, a pagan Arab woman who lived in Mecca did not like Muhammad, and disapproved of his monotheistic teachings, and desiring to cause his as much hardship as she could muster, the woman would throw rubbish out of her window onto his head each time Muhammad passed her house on his way to pray in the Kaaba, also known as the Temple of Abraham. Muhammad endured this insult patiently and never complained to his companions. This trend continued for many months until one day, Muhammad passed by the woman's house and, to his surprise, no rubbish landed on his head. Muhammad looked around, but the woman was nowhere to be seen, and Muhammad became concerned, so he went to the front door of the woman's house and knocked. A weak and feeble voice granted him permission to enter. When Muhammad entered, he found the woman looking ill and also frightened. She was afraid Muhammad had come to rebuke her for throwing rubbish on her head. But Muhammad comforted her and remarked that he had come to check on her well-being, and now that she was in poor health, he vowed to nurse her back to health. He therefore set about cleaning her house and making sure she had everything she needed to be comfortable. The woman was so impressed by Muhammad's behavior that she decided to abandon her past follies and became a remarkable citizen of Mecca. Prior to Islam, Arabia was a lawless region, where the rich exploited the poor and women were treated with indifference. Muhammad preached the message of Islam in Arabia, at a time when human rights had no meaning in most parts of the world. And present-day European civilizations were deluged with rampant wars and massacres, and most societies were entrenched in paganism. In those dark times, Muhammad taught people a message of justice, peace, human rights, animal rights, and even environmental rights as ordained by the one God of Abraham. Those Muslim scholars believe that had the Prophet been present here today, and saw the cartoon makers, he would not have called for boycotts. Rather, he would have encouraged business with them, and even handed them incentives and other rewards. He would have undoubtedly forgiven each of the cartoonists individually, and rewarded them most handsomely, because that was how Muhammad always behaved with his enemies. An example of how Muhammad reacted to insult Violence and ridicule can be seen in his journey to the city of Taif, where Muhammad had gone to call on people to abandon polytheism. At this time, Muhammad was being ridiculed and persecuted by the pagans of Mecca, and those who believed in Muhammad's message were also tortured severely. The pagan Arabs of Mecca boycotted the Muhammad and his Muslim friends for 3 years, and as a result, the Muslim prophet suffered from terrible sickness, hunger, and agonizing poverty. In the same year, Muhammad lost his wife, Khadijah, and his uncle, Abu Talib, who had been a staunch supporter of his cause. Unable to find any ally in Mecca, and without the protection of his uncle, Abu Talib, Muhammad decided to reach out and seek support beyond the city of Mecca. He hoped to spread the message of peace to the people of Taif, in hopes that they would believe and accept the message of Islam. After Muhammad arrived in Taif, he met with the chiefs of the major tribes in Taif, and told them about the basic tenets of Islam, such as worshipping only one God, and abandoning idol worshipping. They rejected his message and insulted him most harshly. In addition to denying Muhammad the traditional Arab hospitality, the pagans in Taif unleashed a violent mob after Muhammad, and instructed the children of their tribes to throw stones at him and drive him out of their town. As the population of Taif pelted him with stones, Muhammad tried to escape the wrath of the mob, but the assault proved too cumbersome. His body was grievously injured from the stoning, and his shoes became soaked with blood that streamed from his body. At sundown, the Muslim prophet finally sought shelter in an empty orchard. Sitting wounded and alone beneath the shade of a palm tree, Muhammad prayed fervently to his God, the one Allah, and beseeched him to forgive the inhabitants of Taif. He asked God to show compassion and mercy to the pagans, and not to send calamity on them. Muhammad did not entertain the idea of exacting revenge on those people who tormented and vilified him. Even when Angel Gabriel requested his permission to destroy the city of Taif, Muhammad opted for mercy and not violence towards them. He was not overcome with rage or hate. Instead of seeking revenge against the people of Taif, he said to Angel Gabriel, "I rather hope that God will raise from among their descendant, people who will worship Allah, the One, and will not ascribe partners to him." How should Muslims react to the drawing of Muhammad's caricatures? Muhammad's life was full of examples of how he treated his arch-enemies. In Arabia, there were people who would stalk him, hoping to get a chance to attack or insult him. Sometimes, they waited until Muhammad began praying near the Abraham's temple in Mecca, and they would throw animal excrement, camel dung and other rubbish on his head the moment they got chance. But Muhammad never punished them for those actions, and in fact, rewarded those vagrants with handsome gifts. Many Muslims feel that if Muhammad saw what the French and Danish magazine had done with his caricatures, he would have asked Muslims to purchase more French products, rather than boycott them. Some people feel that France is an enemy to the Muslim world, but this could not be farther from the truth, because Arabs and their French neighbors have been living peacefully for hundreds of years. Muslims had always loved their neighbors in France, and during World War II, Frenchmen of Arab descent saved many French Jews from the German occupiers. Since there were lots of immigrants from North Africa living in Paris during the 1940s, the Muslims and Jews had a lot in common, similar sounding names, men were circumcised and never ate pork. When the Nazi occupiers started to round up Jews, Muslim neighbors offered them refuge in one place no one thought Germans would like to search, the Mosque of Paris. When the SS arrested the Jews, to deport them to gas chambers, the rector of the Paris's Grand Mosque provided shelter to thousands of Jewish children, and helped the parents evade the Gestapo by distributing Muslim identity papers to the French Jews. Ashkenazi Jews of Eastern Europe are also known to have taken shelter in mosque, where imams often issued Muslim certificates for them. Eventually, the Gestapo suspected several imams of helping Jews, especially after a French resistance fighter gave their location away under torture. The Grand Mosque was raided by the Wehrmacht and SS forces, but the devotees managed to send the Jews to North Africa the night before the raid. The Jews were saved, but the chief imam was arrested and tortured most severely by the Gestapo. But the Muslim man remained brave and did not admit anything. The Nazis were disappointed, because Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler worked zealously to turn Muslims against Jews, and even printed millions of leaflets, scattering them over North African Arab countries. Nazi delegations would travel through the Middle East, imploring Arabs to take arms against their Jewish population, trying to convince them that Jews were terrorists. The Nazis told Arabs they were going to regret not joining them. The Allies were also trying to keep Germans happy, by not giving them any new excuses to exhort the Arabs, so they stayed silent about the Holocaust, although Russia, America and England knew about the genocide taking place. When 2 U.S. senators proposed a resolution to create a Jewish state in Palestine, the Nazi propaganda broadcasts called it an allied attempt to erase Islamic civilization and eradicate the Quran. The executive branch of the American government wasted no time to condemn those senators, and forced them to withdraw their proposal. The Nazi government continued printing leaflets about how dangerous Jews were. Later, the German Nazis changed strategy, and did some research, and discovered that the Arabs believed Prophet Jesus didn't die and would return to earth and fight the Antichrist. This time, Nazi leaflets announced that Adolf Hitler was the resurrected Jesus and the Jews were the followers of one-eyed Antichrist who were moving to the Middle East to take over their countries and occupy the Holy Land. Despite all their efforts, French Muslims continued to help their neighbors and saved them from the Nazis. How did Muhammad treat his enemies? Muhammad was attacked many times during his lifetime, and his home and his city was ambushed repeatedly by both Meccan pagans and Jews of Medina. However, in order to adhere to the strict laws of peace, Muhammad allowed Muslims to engage in passive wars, only as a last resort. While many people with superficial knowledge of history are quick to fling false accusations at Muhammad, and claim he advocated violence, in essence, Muhammad never killed or even struck a single person in his entire lifetime. Muhammad often remarked that if anyone who wishes to achieve lofty ranks in paradise, he or she must forgive the one who has done injustice to him, and present gifts to the one who has never given him anything, and restore relations with the one who has severed relations with him. In his relationship with the Arab population, and the natural world around him, and even the animals that roamed the desert, Muhammad was a living exemplar of human qualities scarcely dreamed of in our time. Islam explains that the act of seeking forgiveness is a means of coming closer to Allah and entering into His love. For Muslims, it is considered a life transformational process and a way to return to original state of purity and innocence. This mode of forgiveness purifies the hearts and keeps men away from hardships and trials. The Muslim God, Allah, has repeatedly reminded people in the Quran about the importance of seeking repentance and forgiving others. In verse 90 of chapter Nahl, the Quran says, Allah enjoins justice and kindness, and giving to the kinsfolk, and He forbids lewdness and abomination and wickedness. Seeking forgiveness and showing kindness to others can have intense effects on removing depression, sadness and grief. In this small vaulted universe, a Muslim is instructed to be inspired by a common desire to understand the rich diversity around him, and achieve communication with his peers and fellow man. In the battles forced upon the Muslims, the Prophet had ordered very humane treatment of the prisoners who fell into Muslim hands. They could purchase their freedom on payment of small sums of money, and some of them were left off without any payment. It all depended upon the discretion of the Prophet or his rightful successors, keeping in view the safety of the Muslims and the extent of danger from the enemy. The captives of the very first Islamic battle, Badr, were freed on ransom, in form of money or work, like teaching 10 Muslim children how to read and write, while those of the tribe of Tay were freed without any ransom. Even in such enslavement, a condition was attached that a mother was not to be separated from her child, nor brother from brother, nor husband from wife, nor one member of a clan from his clan. The Prophet, and the fourth Caliph of Islam, Ali bin Abi Talib, prescribed severest penalties for anyone who took a free man into slavery. On top of everything, Islam has given generous rights to both women and men. Women are often granted more privilege than men and children more privilege than women. The weaker someone is physically, the more rights Islam gives them. The concept that Islam gives women any less rights than men are completely wrong and inaccurate, unfounded, unjust and grossly ill-informed. The life of women in the pre-Islamic period when female infanticide was the norm and when women had no rights at all, were no better treated than livestock. Like slaves, women were treated as an inferior species who had no legal existence. In such a primitive world, what Muhammad achieved for women was extraordinary. The very idea that a woman could be a witness or could inherit anything at all in her own right was astonishing. In fact, during the many centuries that followed Prophet Muhammad, women of the Islamic society had much higher social position than the non-Muslim women of that time. During the Middle Ages, the Muslims were horrified to see the way Westerners treated their women in Europe and the Crusader states. And the European government and Christian scholars denounced Islam for giving too much powers to menials, like women and slaves. Islam first gave women their rights, in a time when women were nothing but the property of men. Islam gave women the right to buy and sell on their own, control business, and express views politically. These were all the basic rights, which the American woman was not granted until recently. Islam encouraged women to study and learn Islamic knowledge, and science and law, breaking a ban which several other religions had stipulated, which forbid women to acquire any religious knowledge or even touch religious texts. It also abolished the practice of marrying women without her consent. Islam also made marriage settlement, or dowry compulsory, for men to give women, at the time of marriage. It allowed a woman to demand any amount of money from her would-be husband, in order for the marriage to be legalized. This religion also allowed women to add marriage contracts where they could add anything to it, as long as it does not go against the Islamic obligatory laws and time limit. In Islam, a woman was able to include deals including, stop the man from taking any other wives, while being married to her. While other women of that time had no say in marriage nor own any money before or after marriage, the men in those societies used to take innumerable number of wives, with no laws to bound them. Whilst in Islam, a woman had the right to earn, spend or keep her money before and after marriage. Islam also allowed married women to spend from their husband's money as if it were their own. However, the husband could not take the money of his wife. Islam gave women innumerable rights, with regard to every law. And, as for the physical protection of women, Islam gave women the right to cover herself, which were not allowed in other places. Every virtue, and every sin, is of equal weight in Islam, be they be committed by a man or a woman. Thus, one would have to be very ignorant indeed, to refuse that Islam was the first liberator of womankind. Britain, and most of Europe, in the same period, was just recovering from the lengthy Roman occupation, which was followed by the arrival of Christianity. European society was a highly fragmented one, in which tribal wars and kingly struggles, to gain control over the land, and people were commonplace. With very few exceptions, women had little, or no rights, or active role to play in such affairs. As the dawn of Islam was starting to illuminate the long shadow of oppression on women and slaves, the French civilization in the same period, 586 CE, only after Muhammad migrated to Medina, and Islam became prevalent, the French were claiming compassion and civility by passing a law and resolution, after great deliberation and controversy, that women can be classified as a human being, and not an animal, however she is created for the sole purpose of serving man. Whereas Islam, the unchangeable religion, was, is and will always be, the first religion to declare every human being, born, to be equal in the eyes of God.